Today, I really wanted to share some insights from what we've learned looking at around 2,000 SaaS businesses selling through Paddle, and what we can learn from them about growth through sort of what is undoubtedly kind of turbulent times here. So I guess I know there are a few people in here kind of who are already familiar with Paddle, but for those of you who don't know what Paddle is, we're a SaaS commerce platform, and we handle checkout and payments and invoicing and tax and more for software companies so that they can focus on growing their business without getting held back by sort of this tooling and infrastructure. And sort of we're in this unique position to talk about growth and churn and SaaS metrics, given that we power financials for thousands of SaaS companies on our platform. So today, really what I wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into is sort of what we're seeing. So as we talk about growth, and this is about growth, I think it's important that we make sure that we think about it in three parts. So the first part is retention, the second part is acquisition, and the third is expansion. So focusing on retention, keeping the customers that you've worked so incredibly hard to acquire over time. Diversifying acquisition, different markets and customers aren't created equal, especially coming out of a crisis or a weird time. And expansion, so focusing on things like pricing strategies to expand revenue, without having to acquire new customers, which is something we're going to touch on a little bit later. But quickly first on retention, some of our friends over at ProfitWell put this together. And in March, we saw the biggest month of churn in SaaS in history. So this report is from ProfitWell's index, and it shows sort of the install base of ProfitWell moving into like a reasonably significant decline in mid-March. But I think like with this, it's important to remember that there are kind of winners and losers in this kind of like aggregate view that we're seeing. And in Paddle, sort of among our customers, we saw some regions sort of boom during lockdown. Italy, as they went into lockdown, we saw kind of sales shoot up 38% in China, 32% versus the daily averages that we were seeing pre this crisis. And with some categories obviously going into a steep decline. ProfitWell actually pinged us some data on this, and they're actually still seeing this sustained higher levels of churn even a couple of months later. And that's similar to what we're seeing at Paddle as well. So as we focus on retention, it's important to acknowledge, I think, that there's a ton of content out there on churn. Huge amounts of what we can do are these marginal gains that we should all be adopting even during peacetime. To continue to improve things like net dollar retention and just grow the business. However, and really what I want to focus on today is a lot of the most impactful things that we can do to reduce churn, like they don't get nearly enough airtime. So I'm going to focus on those things as opposed to a lot of the stuff that we already know about that we should be doing. So as we jump in, first a refresher on churn. So we're going to bucket churn into two different categories. So firstly, we have active churn or voluntary churn. And these are customers who are actively choosing to cancel your product. They're logging in, they're hitting a button that says cancel, and they're ending their relationship with you. And then the second type of churn is this passive or involuntary churn. So these customers aren't explicitly canceling, but for whatever reason, you're not able to bill them, so they end up churning out of the product anyway. And as we think about different types of churn, we think about the different ways that we like work to prevent churn, and these fall into two buckets as well. These proactive and reactive methods of fighting churn. So on the proactive side of things, we're going to call these pre-churn events. So these are things that we can do whilst a customer is still a customer. And then on the reactive side of things, these are what we're going to call post-churn events. And these are things that we can do once a customer is canceled or once a payment has failed. So building on that, we can break this out into 4 quadrants. And this is where you can group your strategies together and hopefully spot where you're missing out. So in the top left of quadrant, these are your happy and active customers, and it's really your job to keep these customers happy and active. You focus on nurturing them to adopt new features, and these are the users actually that if they're on a monthly plan, you should be pushing them into annual. In the top right, we have active cancellations. So these are people who are deliberately canceling kind of a subscription to your product. Here, sort of really your focus should be on finding out why a customer wants to cancel. And then using that insight to make offers to deflect this cancellation request. In the bottom left, we have payment acceptance, and that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But this is actually the biggest driver of involuntary subscription churn is payment failures. But we often group all of these involuntary churn strategies together. We focus on things that we're doing after a payment fails, rather than focusing on optimizing for that payment not failing at all. And that's something we'll get onto in a minute. And then finally, in the bottom right, we have payment recovery. So this is all of the stuff that I think we know about, which is after a payment fails or a card gets declined, what actions do you take to try and make sure that user stays subscribed? So this is examples of things like getting them to update their payment information. But your goal, and really what you should take out of this, should be you want to build a complete churn reduction strategy across all 4 of these quadrants. And that way you're going to maximize your chances of reducing churn. And overall, you're going to improve revenue retention. So you need a combination of these strategies. And what we've done here is we tried to compile the top 5 of these strategies to reduce churn. And we've actually started to quantify them using our data. So from here, you can see that common strategies that we all like to talk about all the time, like cancellation offers and dunning or failed payment campaigns, actually drive the lowest recovery. But they're still important. Interestingly, sort of improving payment acceptance, for example, optimizing your payment stack and things like that, and implementing things like local acquiring, where you process transactions in different regions dependent on customer location, is the most effective method we've seen and actually tested ourselves. So like this all comes from a guide that we've put out as well. And sort of you can go over to our blog and dig into kind of some of this data in a more granular way. It's free. There's a link there. It's sort of on our blog, and you don't have to sign up with any emails or anything like that. But let's dig into these top 5 strategies a little bit deeper. Firstly, don't just let these cancellations kill your business. Add a step after a user hits that cancel button. Learn why, and then try and deflect the cancellation, either using pausing a subscription or discounts or sort of whatever it might be. We see that cancellation offers decrease churn on an annual basis by around 5% of ARR. But interestingly, from our own data on subscription pausing, so that's when somebody hits cancel, instead offer them the ability to just delay paying their subscription or pause their subscription for a period of time. And using that as a strategy, as a deflection from actually like a hard cancellation, we see those companies growing on average 29% faster than those who don't. So we've spoken about voluntary churn and cancellations, but today, really, like what I'm going to focus most on is involuntary churn. Typically, you can expect 20 to 40% of your churn to be from involuntary delinquent churn, particularly if you take payments via credit card. And this proportion will vary reasonably wildly from month to month. But like when you think about this, actually it's a horrible thing to consider. 40% of the customers that you're churning are completely passive. They don't actually intend on churning. And we're going to try and dig into some data on some experiments that we've been trying at Paddle over hundreds of millions of dollars in ARR. So payment recovery is really important. And we spoke about it before, these dunning emails and failed payment emails and things like that you're sending out to customers. And sort of even with our data, we see that customers who use some kind of dunning flow or payment recovery flow or notifications grow on average about 32% faster than those who don't. But really what we focus on is like, wouldn't it be great if we could stop these payments from failing in the first place? Most SaaS companies, I'm sure a lot of the people watching this are aware of and focus heavily on dunning, solving this mess after it's happened. Lots of tooling exists and marketing from other companies around this. But the upstream problem of payment acceptance is way more impactful, and there's so much more money in play, but it is harder to optimize for. It's not just simply sending an email when something goes wrong. Payment acceptance is this, what we call it internally, this $1 million metric that most SaaS executives don't pay any attention to. But it's a core revenue generating workflow. Just how you dedicate resources in the sign-up funnel, lead routing or scoring or billing. Like what we're doing is we're dedicating an entire product and engineering team to one thing, which is improving payment acceptance. So why do payments actually fail? There are a ton of reasons. And again, you need different strategies to combat each of these regions. Banks don't talk to each other in the same way, and they get easily spooked and decline payments. And this gets so much worse when you think about international payments and foreign currencies and sort of all of that stuff. And you need a combination of things. And some of our experiments, like adding currencies or using local acquiring banks, have lifted payment acceptance by 20%. And this stuff is so worth looking into even more. So again, take the time to kind of really drill into the data. The guide and all of the raw data from this and is available on our blog. But the biggest takeaway here should be really to deeply audit your churn reduction strategies. The most value can be derived from the ones that people are rarely talking about, and some of the ones that I'm trying to highlight here. So moving on from churn, and again into this data, let's look a little bit at acquisition. Customers aren't created equal, particularly geographically. And if anybody can sign up for your product and you're self-serve driven or product-led, you're immediately global by default. And there's a ton of optimization that you can do to improve this performance. And what works at home probably doesn't work the same way in China or in the US or in Scandinavia or in India and so on. At the start of this crisis, we actually we saw software buyers react differently in different countries. And really, you need to be aware of these different segments. In our case, the thing that we started to keep track of is how different countries are reacting and how they're buying software after they've been locked down. And from here, you can see sort of a reasonably correlated pattern, but actually just sort of somewhat different behaviors in different countries there. So how do you think about this? So what we did is we used all of our data and we pulled together an index of how hard it is to optimize in each region around the world based on the data that we have and the volumes that we see here at Paddle from each of these kind of different regions. So if we put some color on this, what do we see? In North America, we have big spend. Most companies are set up to optimize there. Kind of credit cards are very common. But really, you need a local presence to kind of really squeeze the last bit of juice out of the US and kind of ease optimization there. Europe is also pretty strong, both for spend and the actual ease of optimization and kind of growing within Europe. Latin America is very hard. Like there are low volumes. It's hard to optimize for because of untradable currencies, country-specific payment methods, and what are actually really incredibly complex things like sales tax burdens and things like that. And surprisingly, in one area of the world that sort of us as European or US software founders don't think about that much is Asia, and particularly the Far East, sort of Japan, Korea, China are really, really promising. So, I mean, let's dig into some of these kind of different areas individually and see what we can do. So in Europe, you should really use Europe as a testing ground. What we found is if you can crack Europe, you can unlock most of the low-hanging fruit from other regions. Don't only sell in euros. Make sure you're optimizing for the various currencies in each applicable country. Test pricing slightly higher in British pounds and Nordic currencies. And remember that cards aren't universally popular. And in some countries, domestic card schemes, like i.e. not Visa and MasterCard, are super popular. And for example, in Germany, we see 70% of transactions under $50 go through PayPal, even for B2B transactions. And the other thing to remember out Europe is sales taxes are super high, 19 to 20%. You owe taxes wherever your customers are. So make sure you work on these things early to avoid fines and penalties. The next is to tackle Latin America later. Software spend is lower. It's about half the size of Eastern Asia in terms of spend and about 9% of North America. But the traffic numbers that some of these companies see are sort of insane. It's much harder to optimize here without a local business entity, banking, and payment method. Tax compliance is a nightmare, particularly in Brazil and Mexico. So like in the US, there's different states have different tax rates, rules, and product category definitions. We did some research, and interestingly, the World Bank publishes an index on how hard it is to go to market in a lot of these different places. And they estimate that it takes about half a year for a full-time tax accountant to file sales tax correctly in Latin America. Whereas in the rest of the world, or kind of at least other Western countries, it's a matter of a few weeks. And finally, Asia is really exciting, particularly the Far East. There's rapidly growing spend on software and SaaS, and it looks to be more resistant economically and easier to optimize for. So one of the big ones here is optimizing for currency. Typically, logistically, it's quite easy. They're quite popular currencies, but can be actually technically quite hard and cumbersome. Currencies like Japanese yen or South Korean won, they don't have decimal places, so that can be a big engineering task to kind of get over in a billing system. But interestingly, turning on Japanese yen and South Korean won increases payment acceptance in those regions by about 11% on average for the sellers that we work with. And in the final section, I'm going to talk kind of related to both of these things about some pricing strategies for 2020. So for starters, murder your unlimited plan. It is not a fair trade of value, and you don't protect yourself against rising costs. Understand truly your value metric and then trade money for it. If you've seen any of Patrick Campbell's talks on pricing, you'll have this hammered into you over and over again, and really recommend you go and kind of look at some of their content there. So I wanted to dig into some pricing pages. So here is a paddle seller actually who builds an API for automatic removal of backgrounds from images. It's a very functional purchase, and it kind of helps us unlimited plan problem. So a bit of context, they're bootstrapped, and like an unlimited plan could actually sink their business. So if we annotate this a little bit, we see they have a free plan for user acquisition. We have subscriptions, which is where they make the bulk of their money, and they're tiered subscriptions based on usage. And then they have this interesting like pay-as-you-go model as a credit system, which helps them monetize the gap between people using the free plan and people using the paid subscription. And then to wrap all of this up, they've optimized and priced in local currencies for the highest conversion. Scrolling down on this page, and it becomes really important, and product-led companies are usually allergic to putting up a button like this. Adding this like contact sales funnel when customers want to spend above a certain amount. But actually, we really recommend this to learn from your biggest, hungriest customers. Talk to them, learn their use cases and their pains, because really isn't that truly just being product-led. You can put them on a self-serve plan later if you don't have kind of the facilities to do this manually. But it doesn't matter. Contact Us is gold for product-led growth companies. And it also validates whether you can make a sales team work for you in the future. This, for this customer, is actually now their fastest growing segment of revenue. It's just this contact button on their pricing page. So here's another one. They've just redesigned their pricing page. And if we annotate this again, you can see they're using feature-based seat tiers by number of seats. And it helps keep things simple. It enables easy expansion without people getting involved in that process. But notice the user limit. If you want more than 20 users, you need to contact sales. And it's worth having the conversation to understand a customer's needs and get that tight product feedback loop within that. But the thing that most people miss is actually having a trigger for a discussion with sales. In this case, they use the trigger of wanting to buy more than 20 seats of their product as that trigger. Interesting as well, they also default to an annual subscription, even with a discount. And that's one other thing that we see among paddle sellers. Ones with annual pricing typically are growing about 55% faster than those who don't have annual pricing. So here, kind of just as a breakdown, we're looking at the impact of these different strategies on overall growth. So you have annual plans, which drive cash flow and decrease churn. You have optimizing for local currencies at checkout, which helps with payment acceptance and conversion, but it also helps you price better for each market. Payment recovery, so these are payment recovery emails and delinquent emails and things like that, captures subscription revenue lost to delinquent churn. Subscription pausing is a really effective alternative to offer to customers when they click cancel. And have an option to sell to teams, agencies, and larger B2B buyers, even if it's only self-serve. We recommend adding a Contact Us button too. So some takeaways on pricing kind of very quickly. You need a combination of these strategies. Kill those unlimited plans. They do nothing for you. Test one-time credits and add-ons on top of subscriptions. Encourage larger customers to contact. Optimize for teams and B2B sales. And experiments like adding currencies and local acquiring has lifted payment acceptance by as much as 20%, as well as boosting conversion and giving the ability for you to charge more. So this is really worth looking into. So of all of those three things, I appreciate I went through it really fast. In summary, focus on retention, especially in a time when we're seeing unprecedented amounts of churn. Diversify acquisition. Different markets and customers aren't created equal, especially coming out of a crisis. Using pricing strategies to expand revenue without new customers. Everything today from this has been a tiny slither of insights pulled from a handful of in-depth guides and data sets that we've been publishing on our blog. So head over to paddle.com/blog to dig deeper. No opt-in, no sign-up, no email addresses, none of that stuff. Just tons of good content and data. And if you want to go deeper on any of these topics, have any questions, want a copy of the slides, whatever it is, just drop me an email. It's christian@paddle.com. And I'm more than happy to help and talk through some of these strategies, either myself or with the team. So thank you very much. Appreciate the happy birthday message from whoever sent that, and all of the really great comments.